Imagine waking up before sunrise in the year 1300. Your stomach is already empty. The fire in the hearth died sometime during the night, and the small wooden cottage smells faintly of smoke, damp straw, and yesterday's soup, not meat, not bread fresh from the oven, just soup. Because here's something most people never realize about the Middle Ages. Peasants, the vast majority of the population, almost never ate the kinds of foods we associate with medieval feasts. No roasted boar, no golden turkeys, no tables piled with meat and fruit. Those meals belonged to kings, lords, and the rare celebration. For peasants, food was something very different. It was repetitive, simple, and sometimes barely enough to survive. So what did they actually eat? To understand that, imagine stepping into a medieval village at dawn. Mist hangs low over muddy fields. Chickens scratch in the dirt. Somewhere, a church bell echoes across the valley. Inside a small cottage, a woman kneels beside a black iron pot hanging over a weak fire. She stirs slowly. Inside the pot is the single most common food in the medieval world: pottage. If you lived as a peasant, this meal would appear on your table almost every day of your life. Morning, midday, night. Pottage wasn't really a recipe. It was more like a survival system. Take a pot, add water, then throw in whatever food you have. Maybe onions, maybe cabbage, maybe leeks pulled from a garden behind the house. Sometimes barley or oats. If the family was lucky, a few beans or peas. The pot simmered for hours, sometimes days. Each time someone ate a bowl, more water and vegetables were added. In many homes, the same pot never truly emptied. It simply evolved, day after day, week after week. The result was a thick, murky stew that could look completely different depending on the season. But one thing was almost always missing: meat. Contrary to popular belief, peasants rarely ate meat. Livestock were far too valuable to slaughter casually. A cow meant milk. A chicken meant eggs. A pig was sometimes raised for months, or even a full year, before being killed in late autumn. And when that pig was finally butchered, the meat wasn't eaten immediately. It was salted, smoked, preserved, carefully rationed to last through winter, which meant that in everyday meals, meat was often just a memory. Maybe a small strip of bacon, maybe a bone dropped into the pot for flavor. More often, nothing at all. Instead, peasants relied heavily on grains. Not the soft white bread many people imagine. That was expensive, reserved for wealthy tables. Peasant bread was dark, dense, and sometimes surprisingly rough. It was usually made from rye or barley, sometimes even mixed with ground peas or beans. In bad harvest years, things became worse. Flour might be stretched with weeds, tree bark, or acorns. Bread wasn't just food, it was survival. And then there was another daily staple most people today would never expect: beer. Yes, beer. Even children drank it. Not because medieval peasants loved alcohol, but because water in many villages was dangerously contaminated. Streams carried waste. Wells could become polluted. But the brewing process, boiling water and fermenting grain, made beer safer to drink. So instead of water, peasants often drank what historians call small beer, a weak, cloudy brew with very little alcohol, but enough nutrition to provide calories during long days of farm labor. By midday, after hours, in the fields, a peasant's meal might look painfully simple. A chunk of dark bread, a wooden bowl of pottage, and a mug of weak beer. No spices, no sauces, no luxury. Just enough fuel to keep working. But the real surprise about medieval peasant food is that sometimes, hidden within this simple diet, were ingredients that would shock modern viewers. Animals we rarely eat today, strange vegetables now forgotten, and meals that could become disturbingly desperate, because when harvests failed or winter dragged on too long, the medieval menu could become far darker than most people imagine, and what peasants were forced to eat in those moments might completely change how you see the Middle Ages. Now imagine the same village. A few months later, winter has arrived. The fields are frozen solid. The wind cuts through the cracks in wooden walls. Smoke rises from cottages, where families huddle around weak fires, trying to stretch the last of their food. Because winter was the real test of survival in the Middle Ages. If the harvest had been good, a peasant family might make it through the cold months with salted pork, stored grain, and root vegetables. But if the harvest failed, everything changed. The comfortable routine of pottage and bread could quickly turn into something far more desperate. One of the first things peasants relied on during hard times were root vegetables. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, though not the bright orange ones we know today. Medieval carrots were often purple or pale yellow. These vegetables could survive underground through the cold, acting like natural storage containers buried beneath the soil. A pot of winter pottage might be filled mostly with these roots, boiled until soft, thickened with whatever grain remained in storage. But as supplies shrank, the meals became thinner, the stew more watery, the bread smaller. And eventually, families began looking for food outside the farm. The forests surrounding medieval villages weren't just wilderness. They were emergency pantries. Peasants gathered wild foods that rarely appear in modern diets. Nettles, for example, were surprisingly common. Once boiled, their sting disappeared, leaving behind a leafy green rich in nutrients. Dandelion leaves, wild garlic, sorrel, even young tree leaves could be added to soup for flavor and sustenance. And then there were acorns. Today, they're mostly associated with squirrels, but medieval peasants often collected them in large quantities. After soaking and grinding to remove bitterness, acorns could be turned into a rough kind of flour. It wasn't delicious, but in a hungry winter, it could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Protein was even harder to find, so villagers turned to whatever animals they could catch. Snails were common across much of Europe. Frogs, too. Small birds trapped in simple snares. Even hedgehogs sometimes appeared in medieval cooking records, roasted or baked inside clay. To modern audiences, these foods might sound unusual, but for a peasant family facing months of cold and hunger, they were simply food. And sometimes, things became even more extreme. Historical records from famine years describe people grinding grass seeds, mixing flour with tree bark, or boiling leather scraps to extract any remaining nutrients. During the worst crises, entire regions could collapse into starvation. One chronicler from the 14th century wrote about villages where people wandered the roads searching desperately for anything edible. The medieval diet, for peasants, wasn't just about tradition. It was about survival in a fragile system where one bad harvest could threaten thousands of lives. And yet, despite these hardships, medieval peasants weren't constantly starving. In fact, during good years, their diet could be surprisingly balanced. Grains provided carbohydrates. Vegetables supplied vitamins. Beans and peas offered plant protein. Milk, cheese, and eggs occasionally appeared on the table. Simple food, yes, but often nourishing enough to sustain the back-breaking labor of farming from sunrise to sunset. Still, the contrast between rich and poor was enormous. While peasants ate dark bread and endless bowls of pottage, the noble class held extravagant feasts, roasted swans, spiced wine, imported fruits, tables piled high with foods most peasants would never even see in their lifetime. Two completely different worlds, existing only a few miles apart. So the next time someone imagines the Middle Ages filled with grand banquets and overflowing tables, it's worth remembering the reality faced by the majority of people. Most medieval lives were sustained not by feasts, but by a single humble pot simmering slowly over a small fire. A pot filled with whatever the land could provide and whatever hunger demanded.